Picture the British Empire at its most confident 1898, a railroad being driven through the heart of East Africa, hailed in Parliament as the Iron Road to Progress. The project had a name that told you everything about who it was really for. The Uganda Railway. Not the Kenyan Railway, not the East African Railway. Uganda, a territory the British wanted to control, and a railroad was the fastest way to control it. Then the memos start arriving at the field office. Workers are vanishing. Not deserting, vanishing. 2 lions operating in coordinated hunts are entering the labor camps after dark and pulling men from their tents. The workers, most of them brought from India, gave the lions a name in Hindustani that translates loosely as the ghost and the darkness. The British officer overseeing the project, Colonel John Henry Patterson, eventually shot both lions and wrote a best-selling book about it. The lions were stuffed and shipped to Chicago, where they still sit today in the Field Museum, behind glass, in permanent stillness. The 2,500 workers who died building that railroad received no such monument. And through all of it, through 9 months of night hunts and terror, through the near collapse of the entire project, the Empire's response was to keep laying track. Because this railroad was never really about the workers. It was about something the British had understood about iron rails for 70 years, that whoever controls the line controls everything the line touches. The story of the Uganda Railway is really the story of what railroads actually are. And that story begins not in Africa, but in a Welsh coal mine. Long before a steam engine ever moved a wheel, before a passenger ever boarded a train. Before the word railroad existed in any language, there were tracks. They were made of wood. They ran through darkness. And the people who used them were miners. Sometime in the early 16th century, historians place it most likely in Central Europe, in the mining regions of what is now Germany and the Czech Republic. Workers in underground coal and ore mines began laying wooden planks along the floors of their tunnels. Not for walking on. For wheels. Small carts loaded with rock and ore could be pushed or pulled along these planks with far less friction than bare earth. The efficiency gain was significant enough that the practice spread quickly. By the late 1500s, wooden railed wagonways had appeared in England, most notably in the coal country of Northumberland and Durham in the northeast. These early railways had nothing romantic about them. They were brutal industrial infrastructure, built in the dark, used by men and boys and sometimes women, whose names were never written down. The rails served one purpose, moving heavy material from the place it was dug to the place it could be sold. Usually that meant running a loaded cart downhill from a mine to a river or a coast where the coal could be loaded onto boats. Gravity did most of the work on the way down. Horses or human labor did the work on the way back up. There is something important to notice here. From the very beginning, a railroad was not neutral infrastructure. It was built to move something specific: coal, ore, timber, from a place of extraction to a place of commerce. The line was always drawn in the direction of profit. That logic, encoded in the very first wooden wagonways of 16th century Europe, never went away. It scaled up, it accelerated, it crossed oceans, but it never changed. For roughly 200 years, that was the extent of the railroad's reach. Underground and overground wagonways, horses and gravity, short distances, industrial darkness. Then, something happened that made the entire system obsolete. And then, almost immediately, made it the most powerful technology on Earth. The man who made the railroad global was not who most people think. Ask someone who invented the steam locomotive and they will probably say George Stephenson or possibly James Watt. Stephenson matters, we will get to him. Watt matters. But the person who actually first demonstrated that a steam-powered vehicle could pull weight along rails was a Cornishman named Richard Trevithick, and on February 21, 1804, in a Welsh ironworks called Merthyr Tydfil, he proved it. Trevithick's locomotive, a small, loud, pressure-driven machine that contemporaries described as terrifying and magnificent in equal measure, hauled 10 tons of iron and 70 men along roughly 10 miles of track. It worked, just barely, and not without breaking the track under its own weight, but it worked. The principle was demonstrated. Steam pressure could move a vehicle. And if it could move a vehicle, it could move anything. What followed was 2 decades of improvement, failure, explosion, and refinement. Steam engines at this period had a habit of killing their operators, and early locomotives were no exception. Boilers burst, tracks buckled, investors lost fortunes. But the engineers kept building, because the prize on the other side was obvious to anyone who understood what coal was doing to the British economy. Britain in the early 19th century was the most industrialized nation on earth, and it was hungry for a way to move things faster and cheaper than horses and canals could manage. The canal networks that had served the early Industrial Revolution were congested, slow in winter, and unable to reach the new inland factory towns appearing across the Midlands and the North. Something had to give. George Stephenson understood this better than anyone. A largely self-educated engineer from Northumberland who had grown up watching wagonways work in the collieries, Stephenson spent 15 years refining the steam locomotive and arguing, often against skeptical investors, that a steam-powered railway could be made reliable enough to serve the public. In 1825, his locomotion No. 1 pulled the first passenger-carrying train on the world's first public steam railway, the Stockton and Darlington. 25 miles, coal and passengers both. The crowd watching was enormous. The noise was reportedly unlike anything they had ever heard. 5 years later, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, 40 miles, steam-powered throughout, designed not for mining but for commerce, carrying both freight and fare-paying passengers on a regular schedule. It was, by most measures, the moment the railroad stopped being an industrial tool and became a world-transforming technology. The real shift came when investors realized that the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was making money. Not just covering costs, making money. Significant, visible, undeniable money. That information traveled fast, and it triggered something that historians now call railway mania. A wave of speculative investment in railroad construction that swept Britain in the 1830s and 1840s, and then, exported on British capital, swept the rest of the world. The wooden wagonway of the Northumberland coalfields had just become the spine of modern civilization. It had taken 300 years. What happened next took 3 decades. By 1850, Britain had laid more than 6,000 miles of railroad track. By 1870, that number had more than tripled. And the British were not building only in Britain. Wherever the empire went, the railroad followed. And wherever the railroad followed, the empire was able to stay. India came first. The first passenger train on the Indian subcontinent ran in April 1853, a 21-mile stretch between Bombay and Thane, watched by a crowd of several hundred invited guests and reportedly saluted by a 21-gun artillery salute. It was presented as a gift, as progress, as modernization, as the benevolence of empire expressed in iron and steam. What it actually was a tool of extraction and control. The British had been trying to govern India from a distance for 200 years, and the problem was always the same. The country was too large, the distances too great, the communication too slow. A rebellion in Bengal took weeks to reach Calcutta by horse. An order from London took months to reach Bombay by sea. The railroad compressed all of that. Within 3 decades of that first run between Bombay and Thane, India had more railroad track than any country in the world except the United States and the United Kingdom. By 1900, over 25,000 miles of line crossed the subcontinent. Those lines were built overwhelmingly by Indian labour, financed by British capital, and guaranteed profit to British investors by the Indian colonial government, which meant, in practice, by Indian taxpayers. The historian Utsa Patnaik, among others, has argued that the railroad system was in significant part designed to move goods out of India toward ports, not to connect Indian towns to each other for Indian benefit. The map of Indian rail lines, if you look at it carefully, tells you something about intent. The trunk lines run to Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, the 3 great export ports. The interior is served by branches. The railroad was a circulatory system, and the heart was always in London. The same logic appeared everywhere the British built. In Africa, the Uganda Railway was explicitly constructed to give Britain access to the headwaters of the Nile and to outmaneuver French and German interests in the region. In Argentina, British capital-financed railroads that, by the early 20th century, carried Argentine beef and grain to Atlantic ports for export to Britain. In Australia, separate colonial railroad networks were built to different track gauges, a technical accident that would cripple the continent's internal transport for over a century. And that historians have noted meant goods sometimes had to be physically unloaded and reloaded at state borders. The United States presents a different case, settler colonial rather than directly administered, with its own capital and its own ambitions. And we will come to the American Transcontinental Railroad shortly. But the pattern was consistent. Wherever you find a railroad built before 1920, you are almost certainly looking at a line built to move a resource, secure a territory, or tie a distant place to a distant market. The railroad did not follow development. The railroad was development, defined strictly on the terms of whoever held the capital. There is a reason the British called these projects civilizing works. The word did a great deal of political labour. It turned a commercial extraction system into a moral mission. It made the railroad a favour rather than a claim. That framing lasted for a very long time, and some of its consequences are still being argued over today. If this has surprised you already, wait until you hear what happens next. Hit subscribe now. The railroad moved empires. The empires moved people. And the people who actually built the railroads were, with very few exceptions, the most vulnerable human beings available. Consider the American Transcontinental, completed in 1869. The story most often told about it centers on the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah. 2 railroad companies meeting in the middle of a continent. A photograph. A celebration. What the famous photograph does not show is the workforce that built the western half of that line. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Chinese laborers, mostly young men from Guangdong province. Hired because they were willing to work for less than white laborers and had a reputation among the railroad bosses for discipline and endurance. They worked in conditions that the Central Pacific Railroad's own management acknowledged were dangerous. They handled black powder and later nitroglycerin to blast through the Sierra Nevada. They were lowered in wicker baskets down sheer cliff faces to drill blast holes by hand. They ate less earned less, and died in numbers that the Central Pacific's management largely did not record. Estimates of the death toll vary enormously, from several hundred to over 1,000, precisely because the company saw no administrative reason to track the deaths of Chinese workers with the same care it applied to equipment losses. When the transcontinental was complete, the Chinese workers were not invited to the ceremony at Promontory Summit. They do not appear in the famous photograph. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act 13 years later, in 1882, barring Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. The pattern repeated with variations across every continent. In South Africa, the Cape to Cairo railway dream of Cecil Rhodes depended on the dispossession of African land and the coercion of African labor. In Australia, convict labor built early colonial rail lines. In Canada, Chinese workers once again formed the backbone of the mountain sections of the Canadian Pacific. In East Africa, as we saw at the beginning of this story, tens of thousands of Indian workers were transported to build a line through territory that was not theirs, for purposes that were not theirs, under conditions that killed at minimum 2,500 of them, and very likely more. The Irish navvies who built the British rail network in the 1840s were not enslaved, but they were desperate, fleeing already fleeing a famine, and their desperation was understood and priced in by the railway companies that hired them. They were paid in truck shops rather than cash in some instances, housed in camps of notable squalor, and killed in construction accidents at rates that contemporaries noted and authorities largely declined to act on. What connects all of these workforces is not simply that they suffered. It is that their suffering was useful to the project, to the timetable, to the profit margins. The railroad could not have been built on the terms it was built unless labor was cheap enough, and labor was only cheap enough if the workers had no meaningful alternatives, no legal protections, and no political voice. The railroad system, in this light, was not separate from the colonial and racial systems of the 19th century. It was one of their primary expressions. This is the history that tends to be left out of the Golden Spike photographs. But it is in the track, if you know how to look. By 1900, the railroad was the most powerful commercial institution in the world. In the United States alone, railroad companies controlled more capital than the federal government. They set freight rates, determined which towns survived and which ones didn't, employed more people than any other private industry, and lobbied legislatures with a confidence that bordered on open contempt for democratic process. The railroad barons, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, were not merely rich. They were sovereign. They governed territory the way kings governed territory, except their territory was defined not by borders but by track. Then they overreached. The specific mechanism of overreach varied by country. But the American story is instructive because it happened fastest and most visibly. The railroad companies had spent decades using their monopoly over freight rates to extract maximum payment from farmers, merchants, and manufacturers who had no alternative means of moving goods. A farmer in Kansas who wanted to ship wheat to Chicago had one railroad serving his county. That railroad set the rate. The farmer paid it, or the wheat rotted. This arrangement generated enormous profit for the railroad companies and enormous fury in the American heartland, and by the 1880s that fury had found political form. The Granger movement, a coalition of farmers organizing across the Midwest, pushed state legislatures to regulate railroad rates. The Supreme Court initially blocked those efforts. Congress responded in 1887 with the Interstate Commerce Act, the first major piece of federal regulatory legislation in American history. It was weak at first, largely toothless, easily circumvented by railroad lawyers. But it established a principle that had not existed before: that a private company operating infrastructure of public importance could be regulated in the public interest. That principle, once established, did not go away. The more significant turning point, though, was technological. The railroad had created the industrial world. The industrial world then created technologies that would challenge the railroad's dominance. The internal combustion engine, developed through the 1880s and 1890s, led to the automobile. The automobile led to demand for paved roads. Paved roads led to trucks. Trucks could deliver goods door to door, something no railroad ever could. By the 1920s, freight that had traveled by rail was beginning to move by road. By the 1950s, the interstate highway system in the United States, publicly funded, the largest public works project in human history, completed the transfer. Airlines took the long-distance passenger traffic that railroads had once monopolized. In Britain, the railroads were nationalised in 1948, absorbed into British Railways and managed as a public service rather than a profit-generating enterprise. In much of Europe, nationalisation produced the high-speed rail networks that would eventually make the European railroad the envy of the world. In the United States, the opposite occurred. Deregulation and private competition hollowed out the passenger network until it was largely symbolic, while freight rail, still profitable, still essential, survived in private hands. The railroad had remade the world. Now the world was remaking the railroad. But something important had been lost in that transaction, and it would take another half-century before anyone began to seriously reckon with what it was. Here is something most people don't think about when they think about railroads. In the United States today, freight rail moves roughly 40% of all long-distance freight by ton-mile, more than trucks, more than planes, more than ships on inland waterways. One freight train can carry the load of several hundred trucks. It does so using roughly 1/4 the fuel per ton moved. The American freight rail network is, by most engineering measures, the most efficient land-based freight system on Earth. You almost certainly consumed something this week that traveled part of its journey on a freight train. You almost certainly have no idea which part. This is the invisible railroad, the one that still runs beneath the surface of modern life, still moving coal and grain and automobiles and chemicals and consumer goods, still following the logic of the original wagonways, from place of extraction or production to place of sale. The technology has changed dramatically. The logic has not moved at all. Elsewhere in the world, the railroad is not invisible. It is the most visible infrastructure project of the 21st century. China's high-speed rail network, the largest in the world by a significant margin, covered over 45,000 kilometers of track by the mid-2020s, connecting cities that previously required overnight journeys in under 3 hours. The Japanese Shinkansen, operational since 1964, remains one of the most reliable mass transit systems ever built, with average delays measured in seconds rather than minutes. In Europe, cross-border high-speed rail has begun, slowly, to displace short-haul air travel on heavily used corridors. And then there is the other story, the one that connects directly back to where this documentary began. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, has funded railroad construction across Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia on a scale not seen since the height of British imperial expansion. The terms of those deals are debated fiercely. Some analysts see genuine development investment, others see a replication of the colonial railroad logic, with Chinese capital replacing British capital and the extraction dynamic fundamentally unchanged. The African governments involved hold a range of views that resist simple summary. What is not debatable is the scale or the historical echo. In Kenya, the country through which the Uganda Railway was built, a Chinese-financed standard gauge railway now runs from Mombasa to Nairobi, covering in 4 hours a distance that once took 12. It was built largely by Chinese construction firms, a detail that has generated significant political controversy within Kenya. The parallels to 1898 are not lost on Kenyan commentators. Nor are the differences. The political complexity of 21st century infrastructure investment is not the same as 19th century colonial imposition. But it rhymes in ways that are worth paying attention to. Meanwhile, in the world's wealthiest countries, the railroad is being reconsidered with a new urgency driven not by empire or profit, but by climate. A long-haul passenger train produces, per passenger per mile, roughly a fraction of the carbon emissions of an equivalent flight. Rail freight is dramatically cleaner than road freight. As governments begin to make serious calculations about decarbonizing transportation, the railroad, the technology dismissed as obsolete 50 years ago, is back at the center of infrastructure policy debates in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1970. The railroad, it turns out, was never finished. It was only interrupted. Go back to that spike being driven into the ground near Lake Victoria in 1903. 2,500 people are dead. The lions are shot. The track is finished. And somewhere in London, a man is filing a report that describes the Uganda Railway as a triumph of British engineering and imperial vision. He is not wrong. Exactly. It was an extraordinary feat of construction. But the report does not mention the names of the workers. It does not mention where they came from or what they were promised or what their families were told. It mentions the lions briefly as a colourful obstacle overcome. It mentions the cost. It mentions the strategic value. It moves on. That is the history of the railroad, compressed into one document. The railroad is the story of the modern world, told from the perspective of the track, not the passenger, not the cargo, and almost never the worker. It begins in the darkness of a European coal mine, a simple solution to a simple friction problem, and it ends, if it ends at all, in a high-speed corridor between two cities that did not exist in their current form before rail made them possible. In between, it builds empires and breaks them. It moves people across oceans against their will and across continents by their own choice. It decides which cities grow and which ones hollow out. It carries wheat and coal and cotton and soldiers and refugees and tourists and mail. It draws lines on maps that become borders. It opens land to settlement and calls that civilization, regardless of who was already there. Every railroad ever built was a choice. A choice about where to go and what to carry and whose labor to use and whose land to cross and whose future to build. Those choices were rarely made by the people who laid the track. The iron hasn't changed. The question of who the railroad is for, that one is still being answered. That's the hidden history of the railroad. If you want more stories like it, subscribe and drop a comment with the topic you think deserves the same treatment next. And while you're down there, tell me which railroad you think changed history the most. The Transcontinental? The Uganda Railway? The Shinkansen? The answer might surprise you.